Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our video on motivational theories. And we usually cover motivation theories at this point in the course as a nice segue from human resource management theory. And we know that motivational theories really did grow out of human resource management theory and the way in which HRM really started focusing on individual employees and the importance of individual employees and the needs of those employees. That's something that feeds very nicely then into motivation theory. In motivation theory, we are identifying the needs of those employees for the purpose of then attending to those needs in order to motivate our employees to work harder and obviously be more productive. And so there's a natural linkage between motivation theories and human resource management theory, as motivation theory really did grow out of human resource management. So our study of motivation theory, then there's a large body of literature that exists looking at what motivates public employees and then how to tap into those motivators. One thing it has found is the literature has found that there's really no true science of motivation. Now, we look at motivation across all the social sciences. Motivation is an important topic, obviously, here in public administration. It's also an important topic in political science, looking at how members of Congress vote and what explains their behaviors and their vote choices. It's important in criminal justice because we look at motivators for committing certain types of crimes. Important in psychology, motivations for how people behave and the way in which they behave, and so on and so on. So motivation is a central topic in most of the social sciences, including here in public administration. But in all of our studies of motivation, what we've realized is that there is no true science of motivation. Instead, what motivation is, it's a collection of ideas, a collection of techniques and skills that can be taught to leaders and managers to help them motivate their employees. So it's not a science as much as it more of a craft. We also know that motivation in the public sector can be much more difficult than in the private sector. We know that the constraining nature of government itself and the political environment can present some real challenges for motivating employees in the public sector. So to pick up on some of that constraining nature of the public sector, we can look at things such as the constraints that are implicit within public organizations. Public organizations tend to be very complex organizations with very complex structures. That type of complexity can make it difficult to have a one-size-fits-all motivational theory that can apply across the entire organization. We also know that we are much more limited in our ability to apply incentives to motivate employees in the public sector. And this, as we know, is much truer for extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic motivators. We don't have the merit pay, the bonus pay, the pay for performance that you would normally be able to rely upon over in the private sector. We also know that we deal with a lot of ambiguity in the public sector. The laws that we are implementing, the policies and the programs that come to us from legislative bodies tend to be relatively amorphous. They're very ambiguous and vague. And so the goals that we are trying to achieve, oftentimes we're not clear on what those goals are. And those goals are oftentimes established by external entities such as Congress or state legislatures or city councils. When the goals we are trying to achieve are ambiguous in the public sector, that then has the implication for performance expectations. It's more difficult for us to establish quantitative empirical performance expectations for the performance of public employees than it would be for the performance of private sector employees. Also, in these very complex public organizations, they tend to be relatively fragmented in nature, a lot of fragmentation of power. And so once you have that fragmentation of power and authority, you end up with a lack of cohesion among all the different work groups and elements within the organization. That lack of cohesion can also lead to difficulties in motivating employees. And then we know the environment in which we operate in the public sector is wholly different than the environment in the private sector. Public sector, we have a very political type of environment, and we are very much attached to public opinion. We're very much attached to public sentiment. And we also know that for the most part, members of the public have a very negative view of bureaucracy. You say the word bureaucracy, and people oftentimes freely associate words such as red tape, gridlock, impersonal, difficult to navigate. So people usually have a very negative view of the bureaucracy. This negative view of the bureaucracy was something that Charles Goodsell discussed back in 1970 in his classic book, The Case for the Bureaucracy. In the case of the bureaucracy, Goodsell basically makes the argument that members of the public tend to have a negative view of bureaucratic organizations based upon the most recent experience they had with those organizations. So they may have had 99 good experiences, but their last experience was something that was frustrating to them, and that then creates this negative impression of the bureaucracy. The implications of this for motivation is if you're a public administrator and you're constantly being told how your organizations are ineffective and inefficient and how you're not doing the job the way in which the private sector would do the job, that's always going to have a depressing impact upon motivational levels. So the moral of the story here is it's oftentimes more difficult to motivate public employees in public organizations than it is in the private sector. I think we all have a pretty good sense of what motivation is. In general, work motivation refers to a person's desire to work hard and work well, to exert this effort on a consistent basis. So desire to work hard and work well and to exert effort on a consistent basis is a good basic definition of this term motivation. I think that consistent element is an important qualifier in this definition. It's not just one-time exerting of effort, it's exertion of effort on a consistent, ongoing daily basis. Before we can really discuss theories about how to enhance motivation in public organizations, I think we first must establish whether or not motivation exists. And we have to have some good ways of measuring motivation within our public organizations. Now, when we're measuring worker motivation, obviously what we are doing is we are collecting information directly from those employees themselves. So we are collecting information from human subjects. As you know, in the social sciences, the primary way in which we collect information about perceptions and opinions from human subjects is through the use of surveys and questionnaires. So surveys serve as our primary data collection tool to measure motivation in public organizations. On the next two screens, we just listed for you some of the common survey instruments that are used to measure motivation in public organizations. The first one is the Job Motivation Scale. This survey is one of the few direct measures of job motivation, and it asks questions such as, most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? Some people are completely involved in their jobs. They are absorbed day in it, day and night. For other people, their job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel in your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that isn't really required of you? And would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in your organization? In a couple of minutes, we'll talk briefly about the Federal Employee Attitude Survey. It's a survey that's done across the entire federal government every single year that asks the question of how engaged and how motivated federal employees are. One of the lowest ranked questions on that survey is this question about treatment and how people feel they are being treated in terms of the work efforts of other people in their organization. So do they feel they're working harder than others in their organization? Do they feel they're rewarded at an equal level as other people in the organization? This idea of fairness, equity, and justice is something that we're going to return to in a few slides because it's important for motivation for people to feel that they are being treated in a fair, equitable, and just manner by their organizations. But that's just one example of a survey that's used to measure motivation. A second survey is this work motivation scale from Wright. I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. I am willing to start work early or stay late to finish a job. Then this next item is a reversed item. So we're looking at an inverse relationship between responses on this item and indicators of work motivation. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my current job. Obviously, a high score on that would indicate low levels of motivation and vice versa. I do extra work for my job that isn't really expected of me. And then another reverse item, time seems to drag while I am on the job. And then a third survey is the intrinsic motivation scale. With this one, we are looking at the motivating effects of the work being done itself. So the actual motivating impact of the job itself. When I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth and development. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do my job well. Doing my job well increases my self-esteem. Then a fourth survey looks at rewards and the expectations of employees in terms of rewards that they expect to receive. This is a major element, again, of this federal employee attitude survey that's done every year at the federal level, asking true, false statements about their expectations with rewards. So statements such as, producing a high quality of work increases my chances for higher pay. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for promotion. And again, those would be answered true, false. Obviously, that first one, higher pay, is somewhat limited in the public sector because of our position classification systems, but it is a good indicator of what types of rewards people expect and if they really do believe the leaders and managers are going to come through with these promised rewards if a certain level of performance is achieved. Then the fifth survey, the peer evaluation, we're looking at others' work. And so for this method, fellow employees will evaluate an individual's work motivation on the following dimensions of things such as team attitude, how much of a team player that person is, task concentration, how well they concentrate on specific tasks they're doing on a daily basis, how much of a self-starter they are, their ability to identify with the organization, their job curiosity, how curious they are about their jobs as well as other jobs in the organization and how those jobs relate to each other in achieving organizational goals. Persistence, how likely are they to persist and continue working toward achieving a goal? And then professional identification, how well do they identify with the norms and the values and the expectations of their profession? But again, this is not a universal list, but those are 5 different surveys that are frequently used in public organizations to measure worker motivation. Because it's first important that we measure how motivated employees are before you can then move to the next question, which is what theories can we then use to enhance worker motivation? I have provided on our Canvas site in this week's module a link to the Federal Employee Attitude Survey. And it's a survey looking at not only federal employee attitudes, but their engagement with their jobs as well as their motivational levels. It's really interesting when you take a look at that survey to see some of the correlations. And one of the major correlations in the survey is a correlation between worker motivation and the size of the organization. Typically, as the size of the organization increases, levels of worker motivation and engagement will decrease. So there's certainly an inverse relationship between motivation, engagement, and the size of the organization. The type of the organization also can have an impact upon worker motivation. Those organizations that have flatter hierarchies, such as commissions like the Marine Mammal Conservation Commission, those organizations tend to have very high levels of worker engagement and motivation, much more so than a much larger organization like a Department of Agriculture or a Department of Health and Human Services. For the most part, when you look at this survey, you'll see, and you can go back years and years. And so this is a survey done every single year. They even did it throughout COVID. So you can go back 10, 15 years and kind of see how these trends and motivation have changed. For the most part, the changes are very slight. You'll have a certain ebb and flow in terms of worker motivation where you'll change by 2 or 3 overall aggregate points. But for the most part, the trend is relatively constant that most federal employees, the vast majority, tend to be well engaged in their organizations and their work, and they tend to be highly motivated as well. But if you have time, feel free to go and look through that survey and you can see some of the interesting findings that the federal government realized with doing this survey of federal employees. We also, before getting into the theories of how to enhance motivation, also have to recognize that motivation is just one factor that contributes to employee performance. It is not the only factor, it is just one. So it's an example of something being necessary but not sufficient. It's a necessary explanation, but it's not solely sufficient. We all know that there are other factors that have impacts upon worker performance, worker abilities, training levels, worker preparation, the perception on the part of the employee of their ability to perform, and if they put forth this effort, what's the likelihood that this effort will lead to a desired performance level. So that's essentially is employee confidence in their own abilities. So there are a lot of other factors in addition to motivation, but the literature really has focused squarely on motivation because that's the area where we can identify certain specific skills and techniques that can then be taught to leaders and managers to enhance the motivation of their employees and then hopefully lead to higher performance and productivity levels. So now let's delve into some of these theories about how to enhance worker motivation. And I think probably the most efficient way to do it is to divide these theories up into two different classifications. There are content-based theories, and then there are process-based theories. Content-based theories are concerned with the actual motivators themselves, the actual needs, motivations, the types of rewards that will motivate someone to work harder and put forth more effort. So with the content, we are looking at the specific motivators themselves that motivate workers to work harder. Then the second classification are these process-based types of theories. Process-based theories look at the psychological and behavioral processes that underpin motivation. So more the process by which these rewards and these incentives are then handed out to employees. So content-based versus process-based. The nice thing about the content-based motivation theories is that we have covered a couple of these already a couple of weeks ago when we talked about human resource management. So people like Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, Douglas McGregor, his theory X and theory Y. We covered those a couple of weeks ago, so I think you're pretty well familiar with those. But then they add two more content-based theories onto our discussion tonight. Herzberg and his two-factor theory, which you probably run into in some previous courses here in the MPA program, and McClelland's need-based model of motivation. So just to recap very quickly, Abraham Maslow, his hierarchy of needs, as you know, he develops his hierarchy based upon deficiency and growth needs. The needs that are located at the bottom of the pyramid are the deficiency needs, things such as physiological safety needs, belongingness and love needs, social needs. Those are all your deficiency needs. Employees are motivated to try and fulfill a deficiency in one of those needs. So the motivation is having a deficiency in those needs. The top level self-actualization, this is being all that you can be. This is a growth need. And so people are continuously motivated to grow and to become better and to develop themselves as human resources. But the so what question here about why Maslow relates so well to motivational theories is because you see your motivators. If you're being motivated by a deficiency, you're in your deficiency needs. If you're being motivated by growth, you're in your self-actualization, your growth need. It's important for leaders and managers to know their employees and know where their employees are in terms of their hierarchy of needs so they can provide the right incentives to then help their workers become more motivated. But then Douglas McGregor, who we talked about a couple of weeks ago as well, building off of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, presented us with theory X and theory Y. As we remember, theory X is this traditional theory of workers. It assumes that workers lack the capacity for self-motivation and direction, and therefore it's the organization that in a very top-down, centralizing, direct supervision type of manner must control and direct the work activities of these theory X employees. Theory Y is based upon Maslow's self-actualization, higher order needs. And it says that when we are designing our organizations, designing our jobs, we need to take these higher order needs into account and try and make our jobs more interesting and responsible through this strategy we talked about known as job enrichment. So if we engage in job enrichment, enrich the job so that our employees feel more connected to their job, so the job provides them with a venue, a forum to develop the skills and abilities they want to develop as human resources. That's how we transform a theory X organization into a theory Y organization. So the so what here is the importance of McGregor is that when you're dealing with a theory Y type of employee, you motivate that theory Y type of employee through appealing to their growth and achievement motivations. If you're dealing with a theory X type of employee, then you might motivate them more through legal compliance and holding them accountable to rules and regulations and procedural requirements. Then there's a third content-based theory from Frederick Herzberg that's called two-factor theory. And this is a very common, very famous theory in public administration you may have run into before. Herzberg argues that there are two types of factors that can have an impact upon motivation. There are what he calls motivators. And for Herzberg, motivators are these intrinsic incentives, things such as interest in work, desire for achievement, and all those higher order types of Maslowian needs. Those are what are considered to be motivators. Then your more extrinsic incentives, things such as pay for performance, other types of rewards, organizational conditions, those extrinsic types of incentives he refers to as his hygiene factors. The difference between hygiene factors and motivators is that hygiene factors do not necessarily motivate people to work harder and be more productive. Instead, hygiene factors will help prevent worker dissatisfaction. So they'll help keep workers satisfied, but they will not necessarily lead to higher levels of worker motivation. If you want higher levels of motivation, you have to focus on these intrinsic incentives, what he refers to as these motivators. And then the fourth content-based theory is McClelland's theory called need-based models. According to McClelland's need-based model, there are three types of motivational needs that employees may have. There's achievement motivation, authority power motivation, and affiliation motivation. Obviously, achievement motivation is this idea of trying to achieve, trying to self-actualize, be all that you can be, control your environment. Authority power motivation, trying to develop your power base so that you can exercise more authority over others in the organization. Affiliation motivation, your more social need for belonging, to belong to and become part of a social group, a social system. McClelland would argue that for most of our employees, they are motivated by an achievement motivator. And he identifies this achievement motivation as a dynamic restlessness to achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by using one's own cunning, ability, and effort. So it's dynamic in that it's always changing, and its restlessness means that it's always going on, and it's a tension that people always feel to try and achieve mastery over their environment using their own skills, using their own knowledge, using their own intelligence and intuition. That's what it considers to be achievement. So if we can appeal to this achievement motivation for our employees, this is what is going to best motivate our employees to work harder and be more productive. So that's for the majority of employees. He says for leaders and managers, they are oftentimes more motivated by authority and power, which kind of makes sense, especially when you're thinking about public leaders. Public leaders have a lot of limitations upon their formal power and authority. They have to share authority with a lot of other people within the organization. They have to share authority with organizations and individuals outside the organization in the external environment. So any opportunity to increase their authority and their power base is something that's probably going to appeal to leaders and managers. Some employees, not the majority, but some employees are more motivated by the affiliation motivation. The motivation to be part of a group, be part of this social structure, to be respected and to be liked by their colleagues. And so for those employees who are motivated through affiliation needs, you would obviously want to motivate those people differently than those employees who are motivated more by this desire for achievement. So again, the basic moral here with the McClelland theory is similar to what we've already talked about, which is there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Leaders and managers need to know their employees, understand the needs of their employees in order to properly motivate employees. What motivates one employee will not necessarily motivate another employee. So to compare these four different content-based models to each other, Maslow to McGregor to Herzberg to McClelland. With Maslow, those bottom order types of needs, the deficiency needs like should be physiological, safety, love, those types of needs correlate very strongly with McGregor's theory X. which correlates very strongly with the hygiene factors of Herzberg, which correlates very strongly with the power and affiliation motivations of McClellan. Your higher order Maslowian things such as self-actualization, those growth needs correlate with theory Y, which correlate with Herzberg's motivators, and which correlate then with the achievement motivation of McClellan. So it's kind of give you a little chart to compare these content-based theories to each other. Regardless of what content-based theory a leader or manager wants to use, it's important that for that theory to work, employees must view the use of that theory as being equitable in nature. They need to feel that they're being treated with equity, that they're being treated in a fair manner by the organization. So on this screen, we have another theory called Adams Equity Theory Scale. And Adams Equity Theory Scale postulates that obviously employees are providing contributions to the organization. They are providing contributions, job inputs such as their time, their effort, their abilities, their flexibility, their commitment, their honesty, their collegiality, their heart, their integrity, their respect. These are all the inputs that people are contributing to their organizations. In exchange for those job inputs, there are also then outputs that they will receive from the organization: a paycheck, benefits, vacation time, security, a job security, recognition, responsibility, respect, sense of purpose, and sense of achievement. Adams argues for equity to exist, there needs to be a balance between the job inputs and the job outputs. Obviously, if there's an imbalance and people feel that they are putting forth more inputs than they are getting out from the organization, that's going to be an imbalance of equity, and that's going to have a depressive impact upon their motivational levels. In addition to this idea of fairness and equity, there's also the concept of organizational justice. Organizational justice looks at how the organization is distributing rewards across the organization, as well as the processes the organization's using to distribute those rewards. So there's something known as distributive justice and something known as procedural justice. Distributive justice looks at the fairness and equitability of the equity of the distribution of rewards and resources across the organization. So that one employee will look at other employees in their organization and say, well, are they receiving more and better rewards than I am receiving? So are these rewards equally distributed or fairly distributed across the organization? Then procedural justice will look at the process by which, the organizational processes by which decisions are made about how those resources are being distributed. So distributive looks at how they are distributed across people in the organization. Procedural looks at the process by which those rewards and incentives are being distributed. Obviously, it's commonsensical that the research shows higher perceptions of justice in the organization are correlated with more positive work attitudes. More positive work attitudes are obviously then correlated with higher levels of worker motivation. So regardless of what content-based theory you're using, you need to make sure that employees do feel that there is both equity as well as organizational justice in the awarding of these incentives. So in addition to our content-based theories, then our second classification of theories are process-based theories. These process-based theories look more at the process of the distribution of those rewards across the organization. Process-based theories are theories such as Paul Vroom's expectancy theory, B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning and reinforcement theories, Bandura's social learning cognitive theory, and then Edwin Locke's goal-setting theory. So 4 different process-oriented theories. Oops. The first one we'll look at is Paul Vroom's expectancy theory. And this is kind of one of my favorite theories because it's very intuitive, it's very logical, and somewhat linear in terms of its thought process. The primary claim in expectancy theory is that individuals who consider an outcome, who are considering a certain outcome, will sum up all the values of those potential outcomes that will result from a course of action, and will then weight each of those outcomes according to the probability of its occurrence. Essentially, what we are saying here is this is classic utilitarian idea. This is rational self-interest. If we assume that employees are rational self-interested actors, any rational self-interested actor is going to try and maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. They'll try and maximize their pleasure while minimizing their pain. So whenever they do this calculus to determine what is the likelihood that I will get this reward or this outcome if I put forth this amount of effort, the more likely they are to get a valuable outcome, the more likely they are to put forth that effort. So this expectancy theory is really predicated upon three main concepts: valences, expectancies, and instrumentalities. Valence refers to the emotional orientation that someone holds with respect to a reward or outcome they'll receive. So how important is it for them to get additional pay? How important is it for them to be afforded more flexibility in terms of how they're doing their job? How important is it for them to be recognized as Employee of the Week? Those are all possible outcomes, and there'll be a different valence or a different value placed upon each one of those potential outcomes. The valence level that's placed upon a potential outcome can certainly vary across employees. So what outcome is important to one employee may be less important to another employee. Then the second concept here is what's called expectancy. Expectancy speaks to the confidence of the employee, that if that employee puts forth the effort, what is the likelihood that that additional effort will lead to this performance level that they are trying to achieve? So how confident are they that their effort will lead to their desired performance? And then the third concept is instrumentality. Instrumentality basically says that managers and leaders need to carry through on the promises they make to their employees. And so if you promise someone, if you get this report done by Monday morning, this will then make you Employee of the Week, then you have to carry through with that promise and make that employee of the Week. So instrumentality is the belief on the part of the employee that these outcomes, these rewards will actually accrue to them if they achieve their performance levels. So the way in which it works, and again, employees aren't going to sit down with a calculator and pad of paper and pen and go through these calculations in a quantitative manner, but on a more subjective type of level, I think these are some of the things that employees will think through in deciding whether or not to put forth this additional amount of effort. So in that formula on the left-hand side, you see the F. F stands for function. So the amount of effort someone will put into their work is a function of. Your first term, the E, the P term, stands for the probability that if this employee puts forth this amount of effort, that it will result in this desired performance level. So E is your effort, P is your performance. So what's the likelihood? What's their expectation in terms of if they put forth the effort, are they 100% sure that they'll achieve this desired performance level? Are they 70% sure? Are they 50% sure? Multiplied then times the next term, which is your P to O. P to O stands for the probability that that level of performance will then result in this outcome. So, think about it. They're trying to get this report done by Monday morning. So the amount of effort they'll have to put in they'll have to come in on Saturday to work on this report. That's the effort that they'll have to put in. So the first thing they'll think about is if I come in on Saturday and put forth this effort, what's the likelihood I'll get this report done by Monday morning? And that's your E to P. Then your second term with the P to O is if I get this report done by Monday morning, what's the probability that I will get this Employee of the Week award that my manager has promised to me? Am I 100% confident in that person, 50% confident? How confident am I that this outcome, this reward will actually occur? And then that's multiplied times the valence level. The valence level is how heavily they weight being Employee of the Month. How important is it to be Employee of the Month? Or are there other motivators that are more important for them? So I think the important thing about Vroom's expectancy theory is it really focuses our attention as leaders and managers on the idea of valences, expectancies, and instrumentalities. Managers must understand what individual employees value, both extrinsic as well as intrinsic incentives. You need to know what they place a high valence level upon. And those valence levels, again, will differ between different employees. Managers need to understand the confidence level of their employees in terms of expectancies. If the employee does not feel confident in their abilities to get the job done, obviously they're going to be less likely to put forth that effort. So we have to understand the confidence levels of our employees in their own abilities. And then third, we have to carry through on our promises with instrumentality. That if we promise, yes, this is a reward that will occur if you achieve this level of performance, we must make sure that that reward actually does get given to that employee. So where we currently stand with Vroom's expectancy theory is the literature has used it very frequently. It's a commonly used theory in the motivational literature. And it's usually done kind of in this regression analysis where we'll create a dependent variable. The dependent variable will be the amount of effort that someone is exerting, the amount of motivation that person has. And we will measure that dependent variable as a function of independent variables, such as some of the incentives like additional pay, job security, promotional opportunities, to see the true relationship between these different incentives and the motivation level of our employees. Again, I don't think we see a lot of employees doing this in a quantitative numerical type of process, but I do think these are considerations that rational self-interested employees will engage in determining how much effort to exert in doing their jobs. So again, I'm a big fan of Vroom and expectancy theory, at least on a conceptual level. I think it makes a lot of rational, a lot of linear type of sense. That our second process-based theory comes to us from the world of psychology, and that's B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. If you've done any work in psychology, you know about B.F. Skinner. Skinner is all over the psychology literature. And Skinner makes the argument that animals, and by extension human beings, will alter and modify their behaviors in response to external stimuli. So specifically with operant conditioning, people will repeat or they will drop behaviors in response to consequences they receive from engaging in those behaviors. So operant conditioning is the use of consequences to try and modify the behavior of individuals. Now, when you're using consequences to try and modify the behavior of individuals, we do know the literature tells us that positive reinforcement is oftentimes far more efficient than negative punitive measures. So it's usually better to use positive reinforcement as opposed to punishment. It's also usually better to use intermittent reinforcement schedules, by which this positive reinforcement is applied at unpredictable points in time. The more predictable the application of the positive reinforcement, the less impact that positive reinforcement will have. So in an intermittent reinforcement schedule where you have reinforcement with positive reinforcement after long varying periods of time, or after varying numbers of occurrences, tends to be much more effective than if employees can predict when those reinforcements will be handed out. Nice thing about using an intermittent reinforcement schedule for these positive reinforcements is that extinction of the behavior that you're trying to generate occurs much more slowly than in a much more predictable reinforcement schedule. The disadvantage of intermittent reinforcement is that it does take the employee more time to acquire that behavior that you want them to acquire. But once they do acquire it, it really does get cemented into the thought process of that individual and its behavior that they will continue to engage in day after day after day. But operant conditioning is basically using this positive reinforcement in order to try and mold and shape the behaviors of employees to mold and shape their motivation. Then growing out of operant conditioning, we have Bandura's, this third theory, Bandura's social learning theory. Social learning theory, as opposed to operant conditioning, doesn't look as much at external stimuli, but instead it focuses on the internal cognitive process of individuals. It looks at how individuals process information and then form behaviors and learn from that information that they are processing. So in social learning theory, the primary claim is that people learn in a variety of ways other than through external positive reinforcement. People learn behaviors through things such as modeling the behavior of others. If you've done work in leadership theory, and we will talk about leadership theory in this class once we get to next week's class session. But when you look at leadership, you know that one of the primary jobs of leaders is to role model behaviors for employees in the organization. People will look at the behaviors exhibited by leaders and managers, and they will hopefully model that type of behavior. They will learn to model the behavior that is valued by the organization. People also learn by living vicariously through others. So someone doesn't have to go through a situation themselves to learn from it. They can watch someone else go through that situation and then vicariously learn through that person's experiences. People in social learning theory can also learn through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so, for instance, if you're going to be doing a presentation, you may rehearse that presentation in your mind over and over again to try and cement some of the behaviors that you think will lead to an effective and efficient presentation. That type of mental rehearsal and imagery can form behaviors. And then self-management through setting of goals. When people are able to establish goals for themselves and then are able to hold themselves accountable for achieving those goals, that can also lead to behavior modification and hopefully make employees more motivated and more productive. But social learning theory really looks internally at the cognitive process of individuals, how they process, how they assimilate and analyze information beyond just providing them with these positive external types of stimuli, these reinforcements. And then the fourth process-oriented theory is Edwin Locke's goal-setting theory. And the postulate of this theory is a pretty basic one, and that's that difficult goals tend to lead to higher performance levels than easy goals, no goals, or vague and ambiguous goals. Goals, once they are established, can help focus behavior and then motivate individuals to try and achieve the desired end state. In other words, trying to motivate them to achieve those established goals. So they're very good at focusing employee behavior. It is important, though, that the organization and leaders have a strong commitment to the goals and that we provide feedback to employees throughout the process of trying to achieve these goals. As the value of the goal increases, we know the commitment to achieving that goal will increase as well. So how specifically do goals affect the behavior of employees? How do they have an impact upon worker motivation? Goals can direct the attention of employees, show employees what is important to focus on. They can intensify the effort of employees, especially if employees value those goals and have buy-in into those goals. They can intensify the persistence of employees and make people hang with trying to achieve those goals over a long period of time. And they can also spark creativity and problem solving. They can make us be more innovative and creative in the way in which we are addressing problems in the organization. The idea with these more difficult goals can kind of be almost counterintuitive in that a difficult goal is going to be much more difficult to achieve. But the greater the success, the greater the satisfaction. So the paradox here is more difficult goals are less likely to be achieved. When those goals are not achieved, it then leaves people feeling unsatisfied, that there is a task that has not yet been accomplished. This lack of satisfaction, this feeling that this goal has not yet been accomplished, will in turn then foster ambition and push people to work harder to try and accomplish known as field theory, in that we all operate within this environment of forces, within this field of forces. These forces will exert pressure upon us. We will react in response to those pressures that are being applied to us. The idea here is that when there are unaccomplished goals, unaccomplished tasks, people will feel pressure to accomplish those tasks, and that will create a tension. The person is then motivated to try and release that tension by working harder to accomplish those goals. So even though difficult goals can be frustrating at times, more difficult goals oftentimes lead to higher levels of employee motivation. But those goals, when they are established, must also be established with management support. They are often good if there are mixed methods types of goals, in that they involve both qualitative as well as quantitative goals. And we need to be very careful at assigning responsibility for the accomplishment and the achievement of those goals. If no one is held accountable for the achievement of the goals likely will never be achieved. Also, other recommendations for using goal setting for the purpose of motivation: empowering employees to participate in goal setting and to participate in the development of strategies and tactics for achieving the goals. Leadership participation is important. As we had said before, feedback is important to provide feedback to employees in terms of the progress they're making toward the achievement of the goals. You need to have commitment to the goals. So the people who are trying to achieve the goals need to be committed to the goals, which means that leaders and managers need to stress how important these goals are. And we always need to be aware of goal overload. Having too many goals means that employees won't know what goals to focus upon, and too many goals may also mean that goals may come into conflict with each other. So those are for what we refer to as process-based models of motivation. So we have content-based models and we have process-based models. Where we currently are in terms of motivation theory is we recognize that there is no singular theory that is a conclusive explanation of motivation. Instead, what we need to do is we need to focus on what are called the middle range theories. We need to develop theories that fit in specific types of settings and specific types of contingencies. There is no universal theory, and any search for a universal motivation theory is going to be fruitless. It depends upon the organization, the people involved, the needs and the motivators of those individuals who you're trying to motivate, the type of work that's being done. It's very much a contextual situation when we are trying to motivate our employees. What that does is it means that motivation is very complex. Just like everything else in public administration, there's a lot of complexity to it. Just like Woodrow Wilson told us back in 1887, public administration is a complex field. But we need to, instead of looking for that one-size-fits-all panacea, we need to look for the theory, the concept, the skill that applies most appropriately in a given situation with a given employee. So it's a very contextual type of a situation. When we are motivating employees, though, a major part of motivation is obviously the incentives that we are using and how we are using those incentives. We know that incentives can be difficult to use in the public sector, especially extrinsic incentives. We have our civil service systems, we have our position classification systems. So if we want to provide someone with additional pay, we oftentimes, that additional pay will come from a reclassification process. But that reclassification process can only occur if the actual nature and substance of the position has changed substantially enough that it will require and will justify a reclassification survey. So pay for performance has not really taken strong hold in the public sector for those reasons, as well as collective bargaining. A lot of public sector employee unions are very hesitant to buy into pay for performance. So for the most part, pay for performance has not taken hold in the public sector. There have been some instances in some organizations with exempt employees where they have been somewhat successful using pay for performance. We know the big cautionary tale, if you remember to your 577 course in the Civil Service Reform Act, the big cautionary tale is what happened when Congress promised bonus pay to members of the senior executive service, then neglected to provide that bonus pay. We know what happened to job satisfaction. We know what happened to the motivation levels of those senior executive service members. So again, if you don't have the resources to provide those rewards, that's going to violate Vroom's instrumentality, and obviously that pay for performance is not going to work in that public organization. Because of these limitations on the use of extrinsic motivators and rewards, some people make the argument that public sector employees are less motivated than their private sector counterparts. So what does the research say? For the most part, the research says that overall, there are some slight differences between motivation levels among private and public employees, but those differences are not considered to be statistically significant. Public employees still tend to show very high levels of motivation across all the studies that we have done. And that is really supported very much by the Federal Employee Attitude Survey that's done at the federal level every year. Public employees do tend to be really relatively motivated and relatively engaged in their jobs. But let's focus a little bit more on the restricted use of incentives in the public sector and what that then means for motivation among public employees. Chester Barnard, who is again all over the public administration literature, we talked about him with human relations. We talk about him tonight. We're going to talk about him again when we talk about systems theory. He's really all over the place. But Chester Barnard also contributes to our understanding of the use of incentives in public organizations. And Barnard makes the argument there are two classifications of incentives that can be used. There are worker-specific incentives, and then there are non-worker-specific incentives. Worker-specific incentives are those material, those non-material, those work condition types of incentives that are tied directly to individual employees. Obviously, non-specific incentives are going to be your more general incentives, such as being free from hostility, having the opportunity to work in customary and comfortable practices that you are familiar and comfortable with, apply to all employees. They are not just specific to one employee. So you can have worker-specific incentives, you can have non-specific incentives. Herbert Simon, another heavyweight, if you will, in the public literature, also weighs in on this entire this issue of incentives. He creates this classification of employee incentives versus employer incentives. Employer incentives, according to Herb Simon, are things such as money, prestige, social opportunities, promotional opportunities. Those incentives that tend to appeal more to employees. The incentives that appeal more to employers are going to be those power and authority opportunities, a la what McClellan told us with his power and authority motivators. Then another theorist is Anthony Downs. Anthony Downs has his theory of bureau ideologies. The bureau ideologies theory contributes to our understanding of motivation by telling us that there are different types of employees in public organizations. And he breaks those types of employees into 5 different categories. He says there are climbers, there are conservers, there are zealots, there are advocates, and there are statesmen. Climbers, according to Anthony Downs, are your younger employees in the organization. They are motivated by promotional opportunities. They want to move up in the organization. They want to get promotions. They want to get bigger titles. They want to move up in their career. And so providing them those promotional opportunities, that's what will motivate these climbers. Now, if climbers are not provided with those promotional opportunities, Downs says they will end up jumping to other organizations. So if you don't keep them happy with promotional opportunities, you're going to lose those climbers. Then your second category are conservers. Conservers are your more veteran employees. They've been in the organization for some time now. They have accumulated the perks of the office. And so they are motivated by trying to keep what they have accumulated, trying to keep those perks of the office. So trying to maintain that status quo is what will motivate those conservers. Zealots are individuals who are very strongly in favor of a specific issue or a specific policy. So they are going to be motivated by anything that promotes and furthers and pushes forward that issue and that policy that they are a zealot of. Advocates are supporters of their department, their division, or their unit. So they are going to be motivated by resources for their department, by providing opportunities to hire new positions within their department. Those are the things that will, organizational changes that will benefit their department. Those are the types of things that will motivate those types of advocates. I think about this akin to when I was a department chair. Department chairs tend to be advocates, and they are advocating for the benefit of their academic department, and you motivate them based upon the resources you can provide to their individual departments. And then your fourth one, the statesmen or the statespersons, Statesmen, according to Downs, these are people who are involved in public service for the public interest. They are motivated by doing what is in the best interest of the public, even if doing what's in the public interest is to what is in their own personal individual interest. So they are motivated by public service, by trying to give back to society and trying to serve the public interest. So the importance here is, again, the so what here is it depends upon the individual employee. Leaders and managers need to know what type of employee they are dealing with in order to know how to best motivate that employee. There's another very famous author that we need to mention in terms of motivation, and that's James L. Perry. And James Perry looks at motivation specifically for public administrators and really focuses on what motivates public administrators. And he comes to the conclusion that it's the intrinsic motivators that are more important for public administrators in the public sector. So things such as their attraction to public affairs, their commitment to the public interest, their compassion for others, their willingness to engage in self-sacrifice. Those are the types of things, according to Perry, that tend to motivate public administrators far more than people who are working perhaps in the private sector. So he provides these questionnaires, these survey questions to help measure each one of these dimensions of public motivators. So for attraction to public affairs, question items such as, a statement like politics is a dirty word, and then strongly agree, neither disagree, strongly, neither agree or disagree, and strongly disagree. Your typical Likert response ordinal scale. To respond to this, politics is a dirty word. That's a reverse question, obviously, a reverse statement, because people are more likely to agree with that, are probably going to have less of an attraction to public affairs and public service. The give and take of public policy making doesn't appeal to me. Again, that's a reversed one. I don't care much for politicians, which I think a lot of people might agree with today, but that's also a reverse indicator of attraction to public affairs. Commitment to the public interest. It's hard to get me genuinely interested in what is going on in my community. That's another reversed one. I unselfishly contribute to my community. Meaningful public service is very important to me. Those are all indicators then, or some reverse, but all indicators of commitment to public interest, and so on and so on. So without going through all this, we can see that what Perry is saying is that there are certain intrinsic motivators that are more important for public administrators than we would see over in the private sector. So the moral of the story here with incentives is that intrinsic incentives tend to be the motivators, just like what Herzberg told us, far more so than extrinsic incentives, which would be more along the lines of those hygiene factors that can only prevent dissatisfaction, but can't necessarily lead to higher levels of motivation. So that's a presentation of kind of where we are now in motivation theory. Again, motivation theory grew directly out of human resource management theory, and that's why we covered it at this point in time in the class. But it is an important element to managing public organizations, because the better we can motivate our employees, obviously, the higher productivity levels they can accomplish and the higher performance levels for our organizations, the more likely it makes us to have effective organizations. And then to wrap up motivational theory, kind of the way in which we do with all of our theories, looking at motivational theory in terms of the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, I think clearly the human relations model is emphasized with motivation theory because you are motivating individual employees in the organization. Internal process model, because you're looking inside the organization at these employees who are working within the organization. Certainly rational goal model, because our goal is to increase motivation in order to increase organizational effectiveness. So you do have a goal that you are working toward. I think the only one that's probably not highlighted to any great extent is the open systems model. You don't see a whole lot of open systems with motivations, much more of an internal focus to the organization. In terms of mechanisms for coordination and control, certainly mutual adjustment. Far above direct supervision or any type of standardization, the emphasis is very much on mutual adjustment. You have to communicate with your employees, learn what their motivators are, and then that will help you motivate employees on a case-by-case basis. In terms of motivational strategies, obviously, we're looking at a lot of instrumental rewards here. We're looking at rewards for performance when possible. We're looking at considerate leadership that's more intrinsic, and group acceptance. I think there's a lot of job identification here as well, that you're trying to make jobs more enriching, to make them more appealing, and goal congruence, in that you're hoping that the goals of the individuals will also then be congruent with the goals of the organization. But that, in a microcosm, is a very large nutshell, is our discussion of motivational theories. As you review these theories, again, this is information that goes beyond the Tompkins textbook, so it's not necessarily information you're going to find in Tompkins. So as you review this information, if you have any questions at all or need any clarifications, as always, feel free to reach out to me. I think it's probably best we do a separate video on systems theory. So we'll wrap up this video on motivation. Then I'll go ahead and prepare a separate video then on systems theory and upload that video to our room as well. Okay. All right. I'll talk to you soon and we'll discuss systems theory.